Connor, after 2 years of building these useless spreadsheets, announced Bradley Westmont, my supervisor, as he walked over to my workstation, it's time you understood what professional efficiency really means. It was a Tuesday in October, and all 23 employees in our department were watching in complete silence. Bradley had called an emergency meeting, claiming that we needed to review our customer service protocols. I sat at my computer, watching him navigate through my files with that cruel smile I knew all too well. 2 years of meticulous work, relationships built conversation by conversation, personal notes about every client we served at Peterson Analytics. This, he said, pointing to my client documentation folder, is exactly the kind of time wasting that is hurting our department's productivity. My name is Connor, and at 28 years old, I never imagined I would watch my own boss publicly destroy the most important work of my professional career. But as Bradley continued his presentation on efficiency and corporate standards, I kept my expression neutral. Not because I was resigned or defeated, but because I had learned to recognize the signs of when someone was about to make an irreversible mistake. And Bradley was seconds away from making the biggest mistake of his life. Conversations about pets, personal hobbies, family problems, he continued, scrolling through my detailed records of every interaction with customers. This isn't professional relationship building, Connor. This is unpaid therapy. The irony was devastating. These records he considered time-wasting were responsible for 42% of the company's revenue growth in the last fiscal year. Clients who used to renew contracts out of obligation now renewed early and recommended our services to other companies. But Bradley could never see beyond the productivity numbers. To him, success meant processing as many calls as possible in the shortest amount of time, not building loyalty that would last for decades. Starting today, he announced, moving the cursor toward the delete button, we are returning to traditional customer service protocols. Efficient, professional, and profitable. I nodded calmly, as if I completely agreed with his philosophy. In fact, I was watching his every move, mentally cataloging every word, every facial expression that showed his complete lack of understanding of what really kept our customers happy. This entire database, he said, pointing to my main folder, represents 2 years of energy wasted on corporate sentimentality. That's when my phone started ringing. The name on the screen was Meridian Consulting Group, and I knew exactly why they were calling. I had received a message from them 3 days earlier asking about my availability for a confidential conversation about career opportunities. Bradley paused his presentation, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Connor, could you please silence that phone? We're in the middle of an important lesson about professional priorities. Actually, I replied, getting up from my chair, I think I need to take this call. The look on Bradley's face changed instantly. He wasn't used to being challenged publicly, especially not by someone who was being used as a negative example in front of the entire department. Sit down, Connor. This presentation is about your work, and you're going to watch it until the end. But I was already walking toward the conference room door, phone in hand. If you're enjoying learning about professional relationships, I said, glancing briefly at my colleagues, don't forget to sign up to see how this story ends. What Bradley didn't know was that by trying to publicly humiliate me, he was about to find out exactly how much the work he considered worthless was worth. And when I got back from that phone call, he would finally understand why some mistakes can't be undone. Connor Matthews. The voice on the other end of the line was professional, but it carried an urgency that made my heart race. This is Rachel Morrison from Meridian Consulting Group. We need to talk. I was in the hallway, far from the conference room where Bradley was continuing his presentation on efficiency to my colleagues. Through the glass, I could see him gesturing dramatically as he scrolled through my files. I'm listening, I replied, keeping my voice low. We know what's going on at Peterson Analytics. We know about your work with client relations, and we know you're being underappreciated. We want to make you an offer. The irony was perfect. While Bradley was publicly destroying 2 years of my work, claiming it was useless corporate sentimentality, a competing company was offering me the exact opposite. What kind of offer? $120,000 a year, plus commissions on customer retention and profit sharing. Complete autonomy over relationship strategies. We start Monday. $120,000. $40,000 more than my current salary at Peterson Analytics. And why are you coming to me now? Rachel chuckled softly. Connor, over the last 18 months, you've had the highest client retention rate in the company's history. 94%. Our analysts have identified that those numbers coincide exactly with when you took over the relationship department. Through the glass, I saw Bradley point to the screen, probably explaining why conversations about clients' hobbies were a waste of corporate time. He had no idea that those useless conversations were responsible for $3 million in early renewals in the last fiscal year. Can I call you back in 15 minutes? Sure. But Connor? Don't take too long. We have other people interested in the position. I hung up and returned to the conference room, where Bradley had paused his presentation to wait for my return. Sorry for the interruption, I said, sitting down again. Please continue. Bradley looked at me with that smug expression I knew so well. Bradley Westmont, 42 years old, operations supervisor for 7 years, was the kind of manager who believed that business success meant following standard procedures without question. He had been promoted not because of his competence, but because of seniority and internal politics. While I built relationships that generated millions in revenue, Bradley organized productivity spreadsheets and attended webinars on process optimization. As I was explaining, he continued, turning his attention back to the screen, these records represent exactly the kind of inefficiency we need to eliminate. He clicked on the folder containing my notes on specific clients. 2 years of carefully cataloged information. Birthdays, family issues, business challenges, personal preferences, everything that turned cold business interactions into genuine human relationships. Take this example, he said, opening a file on Marcus Thornfield, our third largest client. Connor spent 45 minutes on a call discussing the client's dog's veterinary issues. 45 minutes that could have been spent handling 3 additional calls. What Bradley didn't mention was that Marcus Thornfield had renewed his contract for 3 years after that conversation, specifically because he felt valued as a person, not just as a source of revenue. A $700,000 contract that probably wouldn't exist without that useless conversation about veterinarians. Or this other case, he continued, where Connor spent 20 minutes listening to a client's retirement plans. Time completely wasted on unpaid therapy. This time, he was referring to Dorothy Kleinman of Kleinman Industries, who had increased her service package by 30% after I expressed genuine interest in her plans for the future. That was another $200,000 in direct revenue, generated by 20 minutes of unpaid therapy. I watched my colleagues during the presentation. Some seemed uncomfortable with the public humiliation I was suffering. Others took notes diligently, probably relieved that they weren't the target of Bradley's criticism. But they all knew the truth. My methods worked. In the 18 months since I had implemented my personalized approach to customer relations, our division had exceeded every quarterly goal. Customers who had previously considered switching companies were now renewing their contracts early. Companies that had never recommended outside services began referring other organizations to us. Bradley knew this. The numbers were in the monthly reports he signed himself. But his management philosophy couldn't accept that genuine human relationships were more effective than standardized service protocols. Starting today, he announced, moving the cursor toward the delete command, we will return to established procedures for professional communication. Efficient, measurable, and appropriate. That's when I realized Bradley wasn't just criticizing my work. He was about to physically destroy 2 years of documentation that represented the foundation of all our recent successes. Bradley, I said, raising my hand, can I make an observation? He paused, clearly annoyed by the interruption of his grand display of authority. Those records you're calling inefficient are responsible for 94% of our current retention rate. Deleting that information would be. Connor, he interrupted me, his voice carrying a warning note, your resistance to standardized protocols is exactly the problem we're trying to solve here. I looked around the room once more. 23 pairs of eyes watched this clash between 2 completely different philosophies of how to treat customers. Bradley represented the old school, efficient transactions, professional distance, disposable relationships. I represented something he considered dangerous, the idea that customers were complex human beings who responded better to genuine connection than corporate efficiency. Very well, I said, sitting back down. Go on. Bradley smiled, interpreting my retreat as submission. He didn't realize that I had stopped arguing not out of defeat, but because I had just made a decision that would completely change the game. As I was saying, he continued, highlighting my main client file folder, This entire database represents an unacceptable deviation from our operating standards. His finger hovered over the delete button. Personal client issues are not our responsibility. Our job is to provide services, not make friends. And then he clicked. 2 years of work disappeared from the screen in a matter of seconds. Carefully documented conversations, insights into specific client needs, personalized follow-up schedules, everything that had made our division the most successful in the company. The silence in the room was deafening. Bradley turned to face the group, clearly pleased with his show of authority. Now we can start working according to appropriate professional standards. But what he didn't know was that by publicly destroying my work, he had just freed me to accept an opportunity that would turn his decision into the biggest tragedy in Peterson Analytics corporate history. And in 15 minutes, when I called Rachel Morrison back, Bradley would find out exactly how much it costs to underestimate the value of genuine human relationships. I took the call in the quiet hallway, away from the prying eyes of my colleagues. Through the glass of the conference room, I could see Bradley gesticulating dramatically as he explained why conversations about pets were a catastrophic waste of corporate time. Rachel, I need 15 minutes to process this offer. Sure, Connor. But while you're deciding, let me share something that might influence your decision. We just signed a consulting contract with Hartwell Manufacturing. The CEO specifically mentioned that he'd like to work with that guy from Peterson who remembers his wife's name and asks about his grandchildren. My stomach tightened. Hartwell Manufacturing was our second largest client. Robert Hartwell had renewed his contract for 2 years last week, specifically because our last conversation had lasted an hour discussing his retirement plans and how to prepare the company for the transition. Marcus Thornfield also approached us, Rachel continued. He said he's considering changing consultancies because he feels he's lost the personal connection with Peterson Analytics. Apparently, someone there tried to convince him that conversations about veterinary problems were inappropriate for the corporate environment. I closed my eyes. Marcus had called me directly the week before, concerned that his golden retriever had developed hip problems. We spent 45 minutes discussing treatments and specialist veterinarians. At the end of the conversation, he casually mentioned that he was considering expanding his consulting services because he trusted our partnership. Bradley had discovered this conversation through the time logs and used it as a prime example of operational inefficiency during our monthly meeting. How many clients have approached us? 7 in the last 2 weeks. All of them mentioned you specifically. Connor, we're not trying to steal clients from Peterson Analytics. We're offering you an opportunity to work with people who value your relationship approach. I returned to the conference room, where Bradley had paused his presentation to wait for my return. 23 faces watched me take my seat in the front row. Sorry for the interruption, I said, keeping my voice neutral. Please continue. Bradley studied me for a moment, clearly trying to decipher my expression. Connor, I hope you're taking this presentation seriously. Organizational changes require the full commitment of the entire team. I'm paying close attention, I replied. And I was. Every word Bradley spoke convinced me further that accepting Meridian's offer was the only rational decision. Very good. As I was explaining, operational efficiency requires clear metrics and measurable goals. He returned to the screen, where my client file folder had been replaced by a PowerPoint presentation on service process optimization. Starting tomorrow, we'll be implementing a new timekeeping system for all customer calls. The goal is to reduce the average interaction time from 32 minutes to 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I needed 15 minutes just to make customers feel heard when they called with genuine problems. Jennifer, Bradley said, turning to my colleague in the second row, you've had direct experience with Connor's approach. Could you share your observations on his efficiency? Jennifer Patterson had worked with me for 18 months. She knew exactly why our retention numbers were the best in the company's history. Well, she hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with being put in the center of the discussion. Connor definitely spends more time on the phone than other coordinators. Exactly, Bradley interrupted, as if she had confirmed his theory. Excessive time per call reduces our overall service capacity. But, Jennifer continued, her voice growing stronger, our customers always mention Connor specifically when they renew their contracts. And our satisfaction numbers have improved significantly since he implemented the personalized approach. Bradley's face hardened. He hadn't expected Jennifer to challenge his narrative publicly. Jennifer, satisfaction numbers are subjective. Operational efficiency is measurable and objective. In fact, said Dave Morrison, our financial analyst, I can confirm that customers served by Connor generate 38% more revenue through early renewals and additional services. Bradley completely paused his presentation. The momentum of his criticism of my methods was being undermined by hard data presented by his own colleagues. Dave, those numbers can be influenced by multiple factors. No, Bradley, Dave interrupted, pulling out his own report folder. I've isolated the variables. The correlation between personalized call time and revenue per customer is statistically significant. Connor generates more money for the company because it builds authentic loyalty. I watched the dynamics of the room shift in real time. My colleagues, who had remained silent during the initial humiliation, were now presenting evidence that completely contradicted Bradley's philosophy. Furthermore, Jennifer added, when customers call asking specifically for Connor, it indicates that he has built something that goes beyond standardized transactions. Bradley was losing control of the narrative he had carefully constructed. His criticism of my methods was being publicly dismantled by the very colleagues who were supposed to support his position. Everyone, he said, his voice carrying a warning note, I appreciate the team spirit, but we need to focus on established corporate standards, not individual exceptions. That's when I made my final decision. Bradley, I said, rising from my chair, can I make an announcement? He looked at me suspiciously. Connor, if you have concerns about the new protocols, we can discuss them privately after the meeting. Actually, it's simpler than that. I pulled out my phone and opened Rachel Morrison's message. I have just accepted a position as Director of Client Relations at Meridian Consulting Group. The silence in the room was absolute. My resignation is effective immediately. Bradley stood completely still for 5 seconds, processing what he had just heard. Connor, you can't just resign in the middle of a departmental meeting. I can, and I just did. I looked around the room, making eye contact with each colleague. For the past 2 years, we've worked together to build something special here. Genuine relationships that have generated millions in revenue. Bradley just deleted that work because he considers it useless corporate sentimentality. Connor, Bradley interrupted, his voice rising an octave, you're making an emotional decision based on. I'm making a decision based on professional principles, I replied. I work best in environments that value authentic human relationships, not just efficiency metrics. I began gathering my personal belongings from the conference table. A pen I got from Marcus Thornfield when his company turned 10. A paperweight Dorothy Kleinman gave me when she first visited our office. Meridian Consulting Group is building an entire division based on the philosophy you just witnessed Bradley publicly reject. Jennifer was looking at me with a mixture of admiration and envy. Dave nodded slowly, as if mentally calculating his own career options. Connor, Bradley said, his voice now carrying a note of undisguised panic, Peterson Analytics has invested 2 years in your professional development. You have contractual responsibilities. I have ethical responsibilities too, Bradley. And one of those is to work for people who understand that clients are complex human beings, not numbers on spreadsheets. I walked toward the conference room door, but paused before leaving. For anyone in this room who believes that genuine relationships are the future of business, my phone number remains the same. Bradley called after me as I walked down the hall. Connor, you're making the biggest mistake of your career. I didn't turn around. Because I knew that in 72 hours, Bradley would find out exactly who had made the biggest mistake of his career. And when the phone started ringing with clients asking where I was, he would finally understand that he had deleted much more than digital files. He had deleted the future of Peterson Analytics. 72 hours later, I was sitting at the conference table at Meridian Consulting Group, signing contracts that completely changed my professional life. Rachel Morrison sat across from me, smiling as we reviewed the final terms. Connor, I know you can't bring proprietary information from Peterson Analytics, she said, adjusting her glasses, but we want you to know that we completely respect your professional ethics. I understand completely. At the same time, she continued, if clients choose to work with someone who treats them like human beings rather than account numbers, that's a natural business decision. Over the next few days, I began implementing at Meridian the very philosophy that Bradley had publicly rejected. Long conversations with potential clients. Detailed notes about their personal lives. Follow-ups that demonstrated genuine interest in their success beyond signed contracts. The difference was that at Meridian, my supervisors measured success by client retention and revenue growth, not by how many calls I processed per hour. Meanwhile, through mutual contacts in the industry, I began to hear interesting stories about what was happening at Peterson Analytics after my departure. Bradley had personally taken over management of the largest clients, implementing his famous efficiency protocols with religious zeal. Marcus Thornfield called the Monday after I resigned to schedule his quarterly review meeting. Bradley answered personally, determined to prove that efficient relationships trumped sentimental talk about pets. The call lasted exactly 15 minutes. Bradley followed a standard script: review performance metrics, discuss quarterly goals, confirm automatic contract renewal. No questions about how Marcus was feeling about the services. No mention of the golden retriever that had undergone hip surgery. Marcus hung up feeling like an account number. Dorothy Kleinman had a similar experience on Thursday. Bradley called to discuss service expansion, but when she casually mentioned that she was considering partial retirement, he immediately redirected her back to relevant business topics. Dorothy, who had increased her service package by 30% after our conversations about her future plans, ended the call wondering if Peterson Analytics really cared about her company beyond the monthly payments. And I knew that because Dorothy called me directly on Friday. "Connor," she said, "I heard you changed companies. Can we talk about how Meridian could meet our consulting needs?" We spent an hour discussing not only consulting services, but also how she was feeling about the challenges of balancing business growth with retirement planning. We talked about her granddaughter who was starting college and how that inspired her to think about her business legacy. By the end of the conversation, Dorothy had scheduled a meeting to discuss transferring her entire account to Meridian. "The difference," she told me, "is that you treat me like a person who happens to have a business, not a business that happens to have a person responsible for it." If you're following this journey of how genuine relationships transform careers, be sure to sign up to see how this philosophy has revolutionized not only my life, but an entire industry. The calls started coming in with increasing frequency. Robert Hartwell called in the second week. Janice Kowalski called in the third. Vernon Packard scheduled an appointment for the fourth week. They all followed the same pattern: clients who had worked with me for months or years, who now felt disconnected from Peterson Analytics' new efficient protocols, curious about working with someone who still remembered important personal details about their lives. I wasn't actively recruiting. I wasn't making cold calls or sending unsolicited proposals. I was simply being the same person I'd always been, someone who genuinely cares about client success and well-being beyond the financial numbers. But as I built relationships at Meridian, Bradley was growing increasingly confident about his efficiency revolution at Peterson Analytics. Through Jennifer Patterson, who still worked there, I learned that Bradley had given a company-wide presentation on how eliminating corporate sentimentality had dramatically improved departmental productivity. He was processing 40% more calls per day. Average call times had dropped from 32 minutes to 16 minutes. Efficiency metrics were at the highest levels in the company's history. What he wasn't measuring was customer satisfaction or renewal intent. "Connor," Jennifer told me during a discreet lunch, "Bradley is convinced he's proven you wrong. He walks around the office like he's discovered the secret formula for business success." And how are the other supervisors reacting? Some are impressed with the productivity numbers. Others are cautious. Dave Morrison keeps asking about retention metrics, but Bradley always changes the subject. In my fourth week at Meridian, I made a decision that would completely define how this situation would play out. Instead of waiting for clients to come to me, I decided to implement a more proactive strategy. Not to steal clients, but to publicly demonstrate the difference between relationship philosophies. I started writing articles on the future of the client-consultant relationship for industry publications. Articles that discussed how sustainable companies are built on genuine human loyalty, not just transactional efficiency. I participated in specialized podcasts talking about how consultants can create value through authentic personal connection. I accepted invitations to speak at conferences on humanizing business interactions in a digital world. Each public appearance was a silent statement about my philosophy versus Bradley's philosophy. I didn't mention Peterson Analytics or criticize efficiency approaches. I simply articulated an alternative view that highlighted, by contrast, the limitations of purely transactional relationships. Bradley interpreted my growing visibility in the industry as validation that he had made the right decision in firing me. After all, if I was so focused on sentimentality, it made sense that I would seek out audiences that valued that unbusinesslike approach. He didn't realize that every article I published, every podcast I participated in, every conference where I spoke was building my reputation as the customer relationship expert who had turned a small company into a retention leader. And when Peterson Analytics clients read those articles or listened to those podcasts, they would start to wonder why they weren't getting the same level of personal attention that I described as standard for sustainable client-consultant relationships. In the 6th week, I got the call that confirmed my strategy had worked perfectly. It was Gideon Ashworth, CEO of Peterson Analytics. "Connor, we need to talk." I knew exactly why he was calling. And when I hung up that phone, Bradley would finally discover that efficiency metrics meant nothing when customers start questioning whether they want to continue being treated like numbers on a spreadsheet. The real war was just beginning. "Connor, it's Gideon Ashworth. We need to talk urgently." The voice of the CEO of Peterson Analytics carried a tension he couldn't hide. It was 9 o'clock on a Friday morning, 6 weeks after I left, and I was reviewing proposals for new clients in my office at Meridian. "Sure, Gideon. What's it about?" "I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. Can you come into my office today?" The irony was delicious. 6 weeks ago, Bradley had publicly humiliated me by claiming that personalized relationships were corporate time wasting. Now the CEO wanted a face-to-face meeting. "I can be there in an hour." Gideon's office occupied the entire executive floor of Peterson Analytics. When I entered, I found not only him but also Bradley sitting in a chair off to the side, his expression a mixture of contained anger and barely concealed panic. "Connor," Gideon began, gesturing for me to sit down, "let's get straight to the point. We've lost 7 major clients in the last 4 weeks." Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his chair. 7 clients, Gideon repeated, representing 62% of our annual revenue. All of them specifically mentioned that they no longer feel personally valued by our services. "I see. Marcus Thornfield canceled a 2-year contract on Tuesday. Dorothy Kleinman informed us yesterday that she will not be renewing in December. Robert Hartwell has scheduled a meeting for Monday, but his exact words were to discuss transitioning to a consultancy that treats clients like people, not numbers." Bradley finally spoke, his voice louder than normal. "Connor, you violated non-compete agreements. You actively recruited our clients using proprietary information." I smiled calmly. "Bradley, I haven't violated any agreements. I haven't made cold calls, sent unsolicited proposals, or used proprietary data. I've simply maintained my work philosophy." His philosophy, Bradley spat the word as if it were an insult, "is destroying our company." "Actually," I interjected, "your philosophy is destroying the company. You deleted 2 years of relationship documentation that generated millions in loyalty. You implemented efficiency protocols that turned clients into account numbers." Gideon raised his hand to interrupt our argument. "Connor, clients aren't just leaving. They're actively recommending others avoid our services. Our reputation in the market is in free fall. And what's the proposal? We want you back. Director of Customer Relations, $150,000 a year, complete autonomy over customer service strategies." Bradley visibly tensed. Clearly, this offer had not been discussed with him beforehand. "What about Bradley?" Gideon hesitated. "Bradley will continue to oversee general operations, but client relationship issues will report directly to you." The offer was tempting financially, but it represented everything I had rejected when I left. Working for people who only valued my approach after losing millions in revenue. "I appreciate the offer, Gideon, but my answer is no." The silence in the room was absolute. "No." Meridian offered me not only a competitive salary, but something more valuable, respect for my philosophy from day one. "You're offering me a course correction in a time of crisis." Bradley exploded. "Connor, you're being vindictive. This isn't professional." "Vindictive." I rose from my chair. "Bradley, you publicly deleted 2 years of my work, claiming it was useless corporate sentimentality. Now you've discovered that this sentimentality was worth 62% of the company's revenue. Circumstances have changed, Gideon interjected diplomatically. The circumstances revealed who was right all along. I looked directly at Bradley. You turned human relationships into productivity metrics. Clients simply chose to work with someone who still treats them like people. Bradley stood up, clearly frustrated. You planned this. You deliberately sabotaged our company. I simply continued to be the same person I've always been. The difference is that now I work for people who value that approach. Gideon made one last attempt. Connor, what kind of compensation would convince you to reconsider? It's not about the money, Gideon. It's about principles. You offered me a senior position because you lost clients, not because you recognized the value of my work. I walked toward the door but paused before leaving. Bradley, you said I was wasting time with unpaid therapy. Marcus Thornfield spent an additional $40,000 on services after we talked about his dog. Dorothy Kleinman increased her package by 30% after we discussed her retirement plans. Bradley stared at me silently. You deleted a fortune in loyalty to save a few minutes per call. As I left the Peterson Analytics building, my phone rang. It was Rachel Morrison. Connor, I just got 3 calls from potential clients who specifically mentioned your reputation for personalized relationships. We need to talk about expanding our team. As I drove back to Meridian, I smiled at the realization that Bradley had finally learned the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. The question was whether he had learned it too late to save the company he thought he was protecting. On Monday, we would find out exactly how devastating the consequences of deleting relationships that took years to build had been. 18 months later, I was giving a talk on the future of client-consultant relationships at a conference in Denver when I got the call that brought this story full circle. It was Jennifer Patterson, my former colleague at Peterson Analytics. Connor, her voice carried a mixture of shock and melancholy. Peterson officially went bankrupt last Friday. I paused my presentation preparation. What do you mean, bankrupt? Gideon sold the company to Hartwell Consulting Group for a fraction of its original value. Bradley was fired 4 weeks ago. Most of us received termination notices yesterday. The irony was devastating. Hartwell Consulting Group was a company founded by Robert Hartwell, the same client who had abandoned Peterson because Bradley treated him like an account number instead of a person. Jennifer, I'm sorry. You had a solid company before. Before Bradley systematically destroyed every relationship you had built, she added bitterly. Connor, after you left, we lost 87% of our major clients in 6 months. 87%. Bradley's revolutionary efficiency had been so devastating that it had virtually eliminated the client base that had sustained the entire company. What exactly happened in the last few months? Bradley implemented a completely automated customer service system. Calls limited to 8 minutes, mandatory scripts, no personal conversations allowed. He even installed monitoring software to ensure that no one wasted time with sentimentality. I imagined Marcus Thornfield, who used to call me just to talk about his golden retrievers and retirement plans, trying to discuss complex problems with a robotic attendant following an 8-minute script. Dorothy Kleinman was the last big client to leave, Jennifer continued. She called Gideon personally to explain that she was transferring her entire family account to Meridian because she wanted to work with people who treat clients like unique human beings, not standardized transactions. Dorothy. The woman who had increased her service package by 40% after our conversations about retirement, family plans, and how to prepare for the generational transition of her company. Bradley had turned that warm, productive relationship into a cold, efficient, and completely disposable transaction. And Bradley? How did he react during this collapse? Until literally the last day, he insisted that the problem was unrealistic expectations of modern customers, and that the market would eventually adapt to appropriate professional standards. Even when we lost our last corporate client, he blamed excessive sentimentality of the current generation. Even in the face of the complete collapse of the company he oversaw, Bradley failed to recognize that genuine human relationships were the absolute foundation of any sustainable business. Yesterday I ran into him in the mall parking lot, Jennifer said, lowering her voice. He's selling car insurance as an independent agent, but apparently he's having extreme difficulty keeping clients. People research his professional background and discover that he oversaw the biggest retention crisis in the history of Peterson Analytics. Bradley had become a living case study in how not to manage business relationships. His obsession with efficiency metrics had destroyed not only an entire company, but also his own professional reputation permanently. Meanwhile, at Meridian Consulting Group, we were experiencing the fastest growth in our corporate history. 22 of Peterson's former clients had migrated to our services, not because I actively recruited them, but because they autonomously chose to work with people who treated them as unique individuals with specific needs. "Connor," Jennifer said before hanging up, "you are absolutely right about everything from day one. Authentic relationships are literally what sustain real businesses." 3 hours later, I stepped onto the stage in Denver in front of an audience of 450 consulting professionals. My presentation was on humanizing business interactions in the age of automation, but the central story I told was about Bradley and the devastating consequences of confusing operational efficiency with relational effectiveness. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, 2 years ago, I worked for a supervisor who sincerely believed that conversations about pets were catastrophic corporate time wasting. Today, that philosophy of pure efficiency has completely destroyed an established company, while conversations about pets have generated more than $3 million in new revenue for our firm. For 40 minutes, I meticulously explained how genuine relationships create loyalty that transcends competitive pricing, how personal attention builds trust that resists competitors' offers, and how truly sustainable companies are founded exclusively on authentic human connections that stand the test of time. At the end of the presentation, I received a standing ovation that lasted 4 minutes. More importantly, I received 29 business cards from CEOs interested in hiring consultants who prioritized human relationships over automated productivity metrics. A year after that conference, I started my own company, Connor Matthews Relationship Consulting. Our mission statement is crystal clear: we treat every client as a unique person with an individual story, not as interchangeable numbers on corporate spreadsheets. Today, 4 years after watching Bradley publicly delete my work while 23 colleagues looked on in silence, I lead a team of 36 consultants who specialize exclusively in building lasting client relationships. Our retention rate is 98.6%. Our waiting list is 5 months long. We were recognized as Consulting Firm of the Year by Business Excellence magazine. Marcus Thornfield is our anchor client and strategic advisor. Dorothy Kleinman heads our Family Business Transitions division. Robert Hartwell has become my personal mentor for organizational growth and national expansion. All of them regularly mention in meetings that they work with us specifically because they feel valued as complex, interesting people, not just sources of monthly revenue. The last update I received about Bradley came via a LinkedIn post. He had written about rebuilding at 48, and was offering webinars on hard-learned lessons in corporate crisis management. I felt no malicious satisfaction or vengeful pleasure. I felt genuine sadness for someone who still didn't seem to fully understand that he had destroyed a thriving company by stubbornly refusing to recognize the fundamental humanity of the people who supported it financially. If this story of perseverance, transformation, and the triumph of human values over cold corporate metrics resonated deeply with you, if you have experienced moments where your values were questioned, your work was underestimated, or your approach was rejected by people who confuse efficiency with effectiveness, please subscribe to this channel right now. Every week we share inspiring stories about people who chose principles over politics, relationships over metrics, authenticity over conformity, and humanity over automation. The real lesson I learned wasn't about revenge, karma, or poetic justice. It was about fundamental alignment. When you consistently align your daily actions with your deepest values, the universe gradually conspires to put you exactly where you belong, working with people who share your worldview. Bradley inadvertently taught me that efficiency without empathy is just automation disguised as competent leadership. And today, every time a client calls me specifically to talk about family, hobbies, personal challenges, or simply to share good news about their lives, I'm instantly reminded that these useless conversations are, in reality, the unshakable foundation of everything I have built. After all, genuine business is always done between real people, never between automated databases.